At 2 in the morning, my dead partner's voice crawled out of the telephone and told me I was being murdered in my own bed. The landline shrieked to life on the nightstand, an antique rotary phone that my late wife Miriam had insisted on keeping because she said digital things had no soul. The ring was a shrill, metallic scream that sliced through the pharmaceutical fog I had been drowning in since June. I fumbled for the handset, my fingers thick and clumsy, trembling with what Dr. Cross had confidently diagnosed as early-stage Parkinson's disease. The bedroom was a cavern of shadows, the only light, a thin blue thread of moonlight, slipping through a crack in the curtains. The air was heavy, saturated with the cloying sweetness of Celeste's lavender diffuser, a scent she swore was therapeutic, placed on my nightstand like a silent sentinel every single night. I pressed the cold Bakelite receiver to my ear and heard static, a hissing void that sounded like the space between the living and the dead. Then a voice emerged from the white noise, ragged and desperate, and my blood turned to something colder than the autumn air seeping through the farmhouse walls. "Ray." The voice was a dry rasp like old paper tearing. "Ray, it is Samuel. Do not speak. Just listen. I have seconds before they triangulate this line. Samuel Prescott." I had stood over his open casket at Green Hills Memorial 10 years ago. I had watched them lower the mahogany box into the red Tennessee clay. I had scooped a handful of that cold, damp earth and let it fall onto the brass nameplate with a sound I never forgot, a soft, final thud that punctuated a 40-year partnership in forensic pathology. Samuel Prescott was dead. I had signed the guest book at his funeral. I had drunk bad coffee in the church basement afterward and told stories about the man who taught me that every corpse has a confession if you know where to press. But the voice on the phone was his. The specific cadence, the way he clipped his consonants and let his vowels drag like a man who had spent too many years talking to bodies that could not interrupt. It was unmistakably, impossibly, "Samuel, they are already inside, Ray," he whispered, and I heard something behind his words, a tremor that I had never once heard in the man who could dictate an autopsy report while eating a ham sandwich. "The pills she gives you every night, they are not for Parkinson's. You do not have Parkinson's, Ray. You have a parasite in your kitchen who is slowly dissolving you from the inside out." My mouth opened, a reflex born from decades of cross-examining witnesses and challenging diagnoses. But Samuel cut me off with a sound that was halfway between a snarl and a prayer. "Count the bodies, old friend. You taught me how. Start with Eleanor Marsh. Follow the prescriptions. And for the love of everything you still have left to protect, do not drink anything she gives you tonight. Do not swallow the pills. Your granddaughter needs you alive. Do you hear me? Harper needs you alive." How do you respond when the dead call you by name and tell you the woman sleeping down the hall is your executioner? I tried to form a word, any word, but my tongue was a useless slab of meat, heavy with the residue of whatever chemical cocktail had been masquerading as my 9 o'clock medication for the past 6 months. Before I could force a syllable past my teeth, the line went dead. Not dropped. Cut. The static vanished, replaced by an absolute silence so dense it felt like a physical substance pressing against my eardrums. I held the receiver against my cheek for a long time, listening to nothing, feeling the cold plastic warm against my skin. The bedroom felt different now. The lavender scent that had been a comfort for months suddenly smelled like the embalming fluid I had spent 40 years working alongside. The shadows on the ceiling, cast by the old oak tree outside the window, looked less like branches and more like the reaching fingers of something patient. I sat upright in bed, my spine protesting with a series of sharp, arthritic complaints, and tried to organize the chaos in my skull. My name is Raymond Whitfield. I am 73 years old. For 4 decades, I served as the chief forensic pathologist for the Tennessee Medical Examiner's Office, specializing in the determination of cause and manner of death in suspected homicides. I have performed over 3,000 autopsies. I have testified in more courtrooms than I can count. I have held human hearts in my hands and read the stories written in their scars. 8 months ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease by Dr. Leland Cross, a respected neurologist recommended by my daughter-in-law Celeste. The tremors began in my left hand, then spread. My vision blurred. My memory developed holes that swallowed names and dates like sinkholes. I stopped driving at night. I stopped reading autopsies for fun. I stopped being Raymond Whitfield and became something smaller, a shuffling, trembling reduction of the man I used to be. But sitting in the dark, with Samuel's impossible voice still echoing in my skull and the lavender burning my nostrils with a new and sinister perfume, a different part of my brain was waking up. It was the part that had spent 40 years cataloging the signatures of violence. The part that knew the difference between a natural death and a manufactured one. The part that could read a toxicology report like a musician reads sheet music. And that part of my brain was now asking a question that made my arthritic hands clench the bedsheet until my knuckles ached. If Samuel Prescott is alive, then who is buried in his grave? And if the pills are not for Parkinson's, then what exactly has Celeste been feeding me every night while she kisses my forehead and whispers sweet dreams? The silence shattered. A sound rose from the staircase beyond my bedroom door, soft and rhythmic, the unmistakable cadence of bare feet ascending old wooden steps. One creak, then another, then a pause, as if the person climbing was listening, measuring the quality of the silence above before committing to the next step. I knew that rhythm. I had cataloged it unconsciously over the months the way a forensic mind catalogs everything. The weight distribution, the slight hesitation on the fourth step where the board groans louder, the whisper of silk against the banister. Those footsteps belonged to Celeste. The woman who had made my evening tea for 6 months. The woman who arranged my pills in a little porcelain dish with a glass of filtered water every night at 9. The woman who had kissed my forehead exactly 3 hours ago and told me to sleep well. She was climbing the stairs at 2 in the morning, and she was trying very hard not to be heard. The door opened without a knock, and a thin blade of hallway light cut across the bedroom floor like a scalpel line on a sternum. Celeste stood in the doorframe, backlit into a silhouette that my forensic brain automatically catalogued. 5'7", 128 pounds. Silk robe, dove gray, cinched at the waist with a precision that suggested she had tied it before a mirror. Hair loose, artfully tousled to mimic the disorder of interrupted sleep. Right hand holding a small porcelain dish and a glass of water, steady as a surgical tray. She was a masterpiece of manufactured concern, and until 60 seconds ago, I had never once questioned the brushstrokes. "Ray, honey." Her voice was soft, calibrated to the frequency of comfort. I heard the phone ring. Was it a wrong number? I let my head loll against the headboard, the way it always did when the fog was thick. I allowed a tremor to ripple through my left hand. A symptom I was suddenly unsure was entirely real. "Wrong number," I mumbled. "Some telemarketer. At 2 in the morning. Can you believe that?" Celeste crossed the room in 4 measured steps and set the porcelain dish on the nightstand beside the lavender diffuser. For the first time in 6 months, I truly looked at her. Not as a daughter-in-law, not as a caregiver, but as a subject on my examination table, a body whose surfaces I needed to read for the truth beneath the skin. She was 36, a licensed clinical pharmacist who had married my son Mitchell 3 years ago after a courtship that now felt less like a romance and more like a reconnaissance mission. She had moved into the farmhouse 14 months ago, volunteering to manage my medical needs with a devotion that made neighbors comment on what a blessing she was. "What a lucky man Ray Whitfield is," they would say. "That girl treats him like her own father." How do you catalog the evidence of your own poisoning when the suspect is tucking you into bed? "You forgot your 9 o'clock dose, Ray," she said, lifting the dish. 2 white pills sat in its center, identical to the carbidopa-levodopa tablets Dr. Cross had prescribed. "You fell asleep before I could bring them up." There it was. The delivery mechanism, presented with the tenderness of a sacrament. I had swallowed these pills every night for 6 months, washing them down with filtered water, then sinking into a sleep so deep I sometimes wondered if I was practicing for the real thing. I had trusted her, trusted Cross, trusted the diagnosis, because the symptoms fit, because at 73 you expect your body to start betraying you. But Samuel's voice was still reverberating in my skull. You do not have Parkinson's, Ray. You have a parasite in your kitchen. I took the dish. Our fingers brushed, and her skin was cool and dry, the temperature of someone who had been awake for a while, not someone roused from recent sleep. I filed that detail the way I used to file liver temperatures at crime scenes, a small data point that means nothing alone but can anchor an entire timeline. I placed both pills on my tongue, lifted the glass, and tilted the water past my lips. But instead of swallowing, I performed a maneuver that my body executed with a smoothness that surprised me. I tucked both pills into the hollow between my lower gum and cheek, letting the water wash over them without carrying them down. I swallowed audibly, then exhaled, giving her the performance she expected from a compliant patient. Celeste watched my throat. Her eyes tracked the movement of my Adam's apple, with the clinical attention of a pharmacist, confirming dosage. Then she smiled, and the relief in that smile was so perfectly rendered that I almost believed it. She reached out and brushed a strand of gray hair from my forehead, her fingers lingering on my temple, in a small circle that might have been affection or might have been a pulse check. There you go, she whispered. The fog always lifts after a good night's sleep. She leaned down and pressed her lips to my forehead. The kiss was dry, brief, and precisely centered, like a stamp on a document. Sleep well, Ray. She adjusted the lavender diffuser so the mist pointed directly at my pillow, then moved toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and scanned the room with a quick professional sweep that lasted no more than 2 seconds before her smile returned. Good night, honey. Call me if you need anything. The door closed. Darkness reclaimed the room, and the lavender mist continued its silent work, pumping whatever chemistry it carried into the air I breathed. I waited. I counted to 300, listening to the farmhouse settle, the distant creak of the third-floor landing confirming Celeste had returned upstairs, the groan of old timber contracting in the October chill. When I was certain the house was still, I turned my head and spat. The 2 pills tumbled onto the pillowcase, wet and slightly dissolved, leaving a bitter chemical residue on my tongue that tasted nothing like legitimate Parkinson's medication. I had tasted carbidopa-levodopa before, years ago, during a case involving a pharmacist diluting prescriptions. The real drug was bland and chalky, dissolving quickly with almost no aftertaste. What I tasted now was sharp, acrid, and metallic, like biting into copper wire wrapped in aspirin. I pressed the pills into the pillowcase and folded the cloth around them, sealing the evidence the way I had been trained at crime scenes, with care, with precision, and with the understanding that what you hold in your hands might be the difference between justice and a closed casket. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. The lavender spiraled through the darkness above my bed. For the first time in 6 months, I was fully, terrifyingly awake. Not the groggy half-consciousness that had been my nightly prison, but the sharp, crystalline awareness of a man who has just read his own autopsy report and found the cause of death listed as trust. Harper, my granddaughter, 9 years old, sharp as a scalpel. She had asked me yesterday why my hands shook, and when I said my body was getting old, she tilted her head and said, "But Grandpa, old things do not shake. Old things get still." I closed my eyes, but sleep was no longer possible. The woman who had kissed my forehead was sleeping 2 floors above me, and I could still feel the dry pressure of her lips on my skin. It was the kiss of a clockmaker, checking the mechanism, ensuring the gears were still grinding toward the hour she had already chosen. I was lying in the dark, with poison dissolving into my pillowcase, and the taste of copper on my tongue, and I understood with absolute clarity that the most dangerous thing in Raymond Whitfield's life was not Parkinson's disease. It was the woman who had invented it. For the first time in 6 months, Morning did not arrive like an ambush. I opened my eyes and the ceiling was sharp. Not the watercolor blur I had grown accustomed to, where edges bled into each other, and the wooden beams above my bed swam like driftwood in a muddy current. The grain of the old oak was crisp, each line distinct, as though someone had adjusted the focus on a lens I had forgotten existed. I held my left hand up against the pale October light filtering through the curtains. The tremor was still there, a faint vibration in my index finger, but it was a whisper compared to the violent shaking that usually greeted me each morning. My right hand was almost perfectly still. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt something I had not felt since spring. Clarity, the kind of clean, architecturally precise thinking that had allowed me to stand over a decomposing body and reconstruct the last 72 hours of a stranger's life from the color of their fingernails. The fog had not lifted entirely, but it had thinned enough for me to see the outlines of a truth I had been too chemically blinded to recognize. One night without their pills, and Raymond Whitfield was already coming back from the dead. I descended the stairs slowly, gripping the banister with a theatrical weakness that I was now performing rather than experiencing. The farmhouse kitchen was already alive with the choreography of a family mourning. Sunlight poured through the east-facing windows, catching the dried herbs that Celeste kept hanging from the wrought iron rack above the butcher block island. Rosemary, thyme, sage, the scent was warm and domestic. A Norman Rockwell painting rendered in aromatherapy, but I could smell the lavender underneath, threaded through everything, a bass note that I now associated with the metallic taste still ghosting across my tongue. Celeste stood at the counter, a vision of domestic devotion in a cream linen blouse with her hair pinned back. A plate of scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast, and sliced avocado was already positioned at my place. Beside it, a glass of filtered water and a small porcelain dish containing 2 white pills. The morning dose, arranged with the same ritualistic precision as the evening one. She turned as I shuffled in, and her smile was instantaneous, a reflex so polished it could have been programmed. "Good morning, Ray. How did you sleep? The fog any better today?" I watched her the way I used to watch the living at crime scenes, not the dead. In my 40 years of forensic work, I learned that corpses tell you what happened, but the living tell you why. I cataloged her movements as she poured my coffee, the way her right hand steadied the mug while her left reached for the sugar, her eyes never leaving the porcelain dish at my place setting. She was tracking the pills the way a card dealer tracks the ace, always knowing its position relative to the mark. How do you eat breakfast with a woman who is seasoning your death and smile like you cannot taste it? About the same, I said, allowing my voice to carry the gravelly fatigue she expected. I settled into my chair with a heaviness that was now pure theater, letting my left hand tremble against the table edge. My dreams were strange. I think the medication gives me nightmares. Celeste nodded sympathetically, sliding the plate closer. That is a common side effect, Ray. Dr. Cross mentioned it might happen as we adjust the dosage. Eat first, then take your pills. You need protein to absorb them properly. The casual way she mentioned Cross sent a cold needle through my sternum. She was not just administering the poison. She was providing the medical narrative to explain its effects. A pharmacist and a scriptwriter rolled into a single, smiling predator. A door slammed upstairs, and Mitchell appeared in the kitchen doorway. My son was 45 years old, a licensed architect who had once designed buildings that earned magazine covers. But the man who stood before me looked like a structure in the final stages of demolition. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie unknotted, and his face carried the grayish pallor of someone who had not slept properly in months. He moved to the coffee pot without greeting me, his eyes locked on the floor, the counter, the window, anywhere that was not my face. "Morning, Dad," he muttered into his mug, already turning toward the door. "Running late. Big project review downtown." He was gone before I could respond. The front door closing with a sound that felt less like departure and more like escape. I noted the way Celeste watched him leave, a brief flicker of something hard and proprietary crossing her face before the warmth returned. She was managing him too, Whatever hold she had on my son, it was tight enough to make a 45-year-old man unable to look his dying father in the eye. The kitchen fell quiet. Then a smaller, lighter set of footsteps padded down the stairs, and Harper appeared. My granddaughter was 9 years old, with her mother's dark hair and her grandfather's unfortunate habit of staring at people as though she could see through their skin to the skeleton beneath. She climbed into the chair beside me, poured herself a glass of orange juice with the self-sufficiency of a child who had learned early that adults were unreliable, and studied my face with an intensity that made my throat tighten. "Grandpa," she said, her head tilting at the exact angle I had seen in my own reflection 1,000 times when examining something that did not match the expected pattern. "Why do your eyes look different today?" The question landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Celeste's hand paused on the coffee pot for a fraction of a second, an interruption so brief that anyone without forensic training would have missed it entirely. But I caught it, and I understood. Harper had just observed something that 6 months of manufactured fog had been specifically designed to prevent. She had seen me waking up. "Different house, sweetheart?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and confused. Harper shrugged, already losing interest the way children do, picking up a piece of my toast. "I do not know. Just brighter. Like you used to look when you told me stories about work." I smiled at her, a real smile, and reached for the porcelain dish with my trembling left hand. Celeste was watching. I could feel the weight of her attention, like a physical pressure against the side of my face. I lifted the 2 pills, placed them on my tongue, raised the glass, and swallowed the water with a visible gulp. Then I reached for my coffee with my right hand, using the mug as a shield while my tongue pushed both pills into the pocket of my cheek. I took a long sip, letting the bitter warmth of the coffee mask the acrid chemical taste, and set the mug down. Under the table, my left hand found the cuff of my sleeve and pressed the pills into the folded fabric, where they disappeared into the cotton, like evidence slipped into an exhibit bag. 2 pills, 2 meals, 2 successful extractions. And the question that was now burning through the clearing fog of my recovering brain with the intensity of a surgical lamp: if I do not have Parkinson's, then what exactly have they been giving me? And how many people did it kill before they started feeding it to me? In 40 years, I had opened over 3,000 bodies to find the truth hidden in their chemistry. But this was the first time the body on the table was still breathing, and the pathologist and the patient were the same man. I locked the study door behind me and stood for a moment in the amber light of the old brass desk lamp. This room was the last sovereign territory in the Kendrick farmhouse, the only door with a lock that I had insisted on keeping because an old man needs a place to nap without a 6-year-old bursting in. That was the excuse I had given Celeste, and she had accepted it with her usual grace. Now that locked door was the only barrier between my investigation and her surveillance. The study smelled like a different century. Leather-bound volumes of forensic pathology lined the walls, their spines cracked and faded. Miriam's fern sat in the corner, still alive after 12 years of my clumsy watering. And in the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk, buried beneath old case files and a box of fountain pen cartridges, was the instrument that had once been an extension of my own hands. I pulled the microscope from its leather case with a tenderness that surprised me. It was a binocular compound model, nothing compared to the electron instruments I had used at the medical examiner's office, but more than sufficient for gross morphological analysis. The brass fittings were tarnished, the eyepieces scratched from decades of use. But when I clicked on the illuminator, the familiar blue-white circle of light appeared on the stage like a tiny moon rising on my desk. An old friend, showing up exactly when I needed it. I placed the 4 pills on a glass slide, 2 from the pillowcase and 2 from my sleeve. Using a scalpel from my old autopsy kit, I bisected the first tablet. The cross-section should have revealed a uniform white interior with a smooth, compressed texture consistent with pharmaceutical-grade carbidopa-levodopa. What I saw instead made my forensic instincts detonate. The interior was grayish-blue, granular rather than compressed, with visible crystalline fragments that caught the light like ground glass. The texture was inconsistent, suggesting a hand-mixed compound rather than a factory-produced pharmaceutical. I leaned into the eyepiece and adjusted the focus, my hands steadier than they had been in months. The granules were irregular in size, some coarse, some powdered, a signature of manual preparation that any first-year pharmacy student would recognize as non-commercial. How do you perform an autopsy on your own life when the cause of death is sitting in a porcelain dish beside your breakfast plate? I opened the second pill. Identical interior. The third and fourth matched precisely. 4 pills. 4 identical forgeries. All wearing the same white coat of legitimacy. Someone with pharmaceutical knowledge had meticulously replicated the external appearance of carbidopa-levodopa while filling the capsule with something entirely different. Someone who knew exactly what dosage would produce tremors, cognitive fog, blurred vision, and the slow erosion of autonomy that looks, to any outside observer, exactly like Parkinson's disease. I reached for my old case notebook, a leather-bound journal I had used to record preliminary autopsy findings for 40 years. The pen felt natural in my hand, the muscle memory of documentation overriding the residual chemical tremor. I began to write, and the words came with a clarity that confirmed, more than any microscope, that my brain had been held underwater and was only now breaking the surface. Case file. Unofficial. Date: October 9th. Subject: Raymond Whitfield. Age 73. Chief complaint: progressive tremor, cognitive decline, visual impairment, and intermittent syncope, beginning approximately June of the current year. Attending physician: Dr. Leland Cross. Neurologist. Diagnosis on record: early-stage Parkinson's disease. Prescribed medication: carbidopa-levodopa, 25 100 milligrams, twice daily. Administered by Celeste Whitfield, daughter-in-law, licensed clinical pharmacist. I paused, the pen hovering above the page. Then I continued, writing the line that changed everything. Preliminary finding: prescribed medication does not match pharmaceutical profile of carbidopa-levodopa. Gross morphological analysis reveals non-commercial compound of unknown composition. Symptom timeline correlates precisely with medication administration schedule. All symptoms diminish significantly within 24 hours of dosage cessation. Working hypothesis: subject is not suffering from Parkinson's disease. Subject is experiencing chronic pharmacological poisoning administered under the guise of legitimate medical treatment. Cause of decline: not disease, not age. Deliberate chemical assault by a person or persons with direct access to the subject's daily medication regimen. I stared at the words on the page. In 4 decades of forensic pathology, I had written thousands of preliminary findings. I had documented strangulations, poisonings, blunt force traumas, and deaths so creative they haunted my sleep. But I had never written a cause of death report for a man who was still alive, and I had never named a member of my own family as the primary suspect. I transferred the bisected pills into a small glass evidence vial from my autopsy kit, sealed it with a strip of adhesive tape, and labeled it with the date and my initials. Then I placed the vial and the notebook behind a hollowed-out copy of Gray's Anatomy on the top shelf, a hiding spot Miriam had used for her secret stash of dark chocolate, and that no one in this house knew about except me and the ghost of the woman I still loved. I was closing the textbook when I heard it. The soft metallic whisper of the study door handle being tested. Not a knock, not a call, just the slow, deliberate rotation of the brass knob. The kind of movement made by someone who expected the door to be unlocked and was surprised to find resistance. Then her voice, sweet as antifreeze. "Ray, honey, are you napping in there? I brought your afternoon tea." I heard the ceramic clink of a cup being set on the hallway floor outside the door. The handle released. Footsteps retreated toward the kitchen, slow and measured. She was not angry. She was patient. And patience, I knew from 40 years of studying predators, was the most dangerous quality a killer could possess. I looked at the microscope, then at the evidence vial on the shelf, then at the door she had just tried to open. I was building a case, but I was building it inside the killer's house, using stolen moments behind a locked door that she had already tried to breach. The mathematics of survival were simple. I needed more evidence, more time, and at least one ally who existed outside these walls. And I needed to find Eleanor Marsh. I did not have to find Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor Marsh found me, delivered to my bedside at midnight by a 9-year-old girl in flannel pajamas, carrying a metal box that smelled like rust and reckoning. 3 days had passed since I stopped swallowing the pills. 72 hours of covert sobriety during which I performed the role of a deteriorating Parkinson's patient with the discipline of a man whose life depended on the quality of the performance, because it did. I shook when Celeste watched. I stumbled when she was near. I forgot words at breakfast and stared blankly at the television during the evening program she selected. But behind the mask, my brain was rebuilding itself synapse by synapse, like a flooded engine drying out in the sun. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling and running toxicological possibilities through my clearing mind, when my bedroom door opened without a creak. Harper slipped through the gap like a small ghost, her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her bare feet silent on the hardwood. She was clutching something against her chest, a rectangular metal box about the size of a hardcover novel, its surface oxidized to the dull gray of an old surgical instrument. She stood at the foot of my bed and said nothing for a long moment. In the moonlight, her face was pale and composed with a stillness that did not belong on a child. It was the expression I had seen on the faces of witnesses who had been carrying a secret so long it had become a physical weight, pressing on their diaphragm, compressing their lungs, waiting for someone to say the words that would release the pressure. "Grandpa," she whispered, "I found Mommy's secret box. I think she is hurting people." How do you prepare yourself to hear the truth from the mouth of a child who has been living inside the lie longer than you have? She climbed onto the bed beside me and placed the box between us. It was a fire-safe lockbox, the kind sold at office supply stores, with a 3-digit combination tumbler on the front. The metal was cold against the sheets. I looked at the lock, then at Harper. "Where did you find this, sweetheart?" "In the laundry room," she said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact precision of a child who had rehearsed this moment. "Behind the dryer. There is a loose panel in the wall. Mommy checks it every week when she thinks I am at school. But sometimes I come home early from the bus and watch from the hallway." She had been surveilling her own mother, a 9-year-old conducting counterintelligence operations from behind a doorframe while the target sorted laundry. I felt something shift in my chest. A compound of pride and grief so intense it threatened to crack the professional composure I needed to maintain. "Do you know the combination?" I asked. Harper nodded. "It is my birthday. 0417. April 17th. The combination was her daughter's birthday. I filed that detail and turned the tumbler. The lock clicked open with a sound that felt like the first crack in a dam. I lifted the lid and the contents arranged themselves before me with the silent authority of evidence that has been waiting to be read. 7 small glass vials, each roughly the size of my thumb, arranged in a neat row along the bottom of the box. Every vial contained a residue of white powder, and every label had been meticulously removed, leaving only a faint adhesive outline where the pharmaceutical identification had once been. Beside the vials, a small leather-bound notebook, its cover soft and worn from frequent handling. I opened the notebook. The handwriting was Celeste's, a neat clinical script I recognized from the medication logs she kept on the kitchen counter. But these were not dosage records. Each page contained a single entry consisting of a full name, a date, and a brief notation in medical shorthand that I recognized from my years of reading clinical charts. Eleanor Marsh, February 14th. Cardiac event, secondary to chronic benzodiazepine toxicity. Duration, 11 months. Asset liquidation, 1.3 million. The name Samuel had told me to find. The first dot on a map I had not yet seen but was now holding in my hands. I turned the page. Gerald Overton, September 2nd. Respiratory failure secondary to opioid-induced suppression. Duration, 8 months. Asset liquidation, 2.1 million. Page after page. 7 names. 7 dates. 7 deaths, each attributed to a natural or medically plausible cause, each preceded by months of pharmaceutical manipulation, and each followed by an asset figure that made the motive as transparent as glass. I was not reading a journal. I was reading a ledger, a profit and loss statement written in human lives by a woman who balanced her books with funeral programs. Harper watched me read, her small hands folded in her lap. She was not crying. She was waiting, the way a witness waits for the detective to finish examining the evidence before asking what happens next. I checked the names at the library. "Grandpa," she said quietly. "On the computers at school. Every single one of them has a death notice. I printed them out, but I was scared to bring the papers home, so I memorized the dates instead. They all match." She had cross-referenced the notebook against public obituary records. She was 9 years old, and she had independently corroborated a serial murder timeline using a school library computer and the analytical instinct of a forensic investigator. My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. I turned to the last page of the notebook, and the air in the room changed. The handwriting was the same neat clinical script, but the ink was different. Red, a single entry, written in a color that screamed against the pale cream of the page like blood on a hospital sheet. Raymond Whitfield, November 1st. Cardiac event, secondary to chronic pharmacological toxicity. Duration, 6 months. Asset liquidation, 9.2 million. November 1st. 3 weeks from tonight. My expiration date, written in red ink by the woman who slept 2 floors above me, documented in the same ledger that recorded 7 other lives she had already cashed out. I closed the notebook and looked at Harper. She was staring at my name on the page with an expression that no child should ever have to wear, the look of someone who has just seen their grandfather's death sentence written in their mother's handwriting. Then she said something that reached into my chest and rearranged everything I thought I knew about courage. "I already knew your name would be in there, Grandpa. That is why I brought it to you. Because you are the only person in this house who knows how to read the dead. And I do not want you to become one of them." I pulled her into my arms and held her against my chest, feeling the hummingbird rhythm of her heart against my ribs. She smelled like soap and pencil shavings, and the clean, uncorrupted innocence of a child who had chosen truth over the comfortable lie of pretending her mother was not a monster. But as I held her, my eyes drifted back to the combination lock on the box. 0417. Harper's birthday. Celeste had chosen a code that her daughter could easily guess. A pharmacist meticulous enough to remove every label from every vial, careful enough to hide the box behind a false panel. And yet she had set the combination to her own child's birthday. Either Celeste had made an uncharacteristic mistake, or she had wanted Harper to find this box. And that possibility was more frightening than anything written on those pages. The most dangerous piece of evidence is the one you cannot hide fast enough. I waited until Harper's breathing settled into the slow rhythm of childhood sleep before I eased her head onto the pillow and slipped out of bed. The metal box sat on the mattress, its contents heavy with 7 extinguished lives and the scheduled extinction of an 8th. I needed to move it somewhere Celeste would never look. My study. The loose floorboard beneath the Persian rug Miriam had bought at an auction in Knoxville 20 years ago. The board had warped with age, creating a gap between the joist and the subfloor just wide enough to conceal a lockbox. I carried the box downstairs in the dark, my bare feet memorizing each creak to avoid the boards that sang. In the study, I lifted the rug, pried the warped plank with a letter opener, and slid the box into the darkness beneath. Invisible. Even if Celeste searched the room, she would find nothing but old books and a dying fern. But the question from Harper's visit was still feeding. The combination. 0417. A pharmacist who removes every label, who hides her ledger behind a false wall, who orchestrates deaths with clinical precision, does not accidentally set the combination to a number her daughter knows by heart. Either Celeste wanted Harper to find the box, or she had underestimated her own child. And predators who underestimate their environment do not survive 12 years and 7 kills. The following morning, I waited until Celeste drove Harper to school and Mitchell left for work. The farmhouse was mine for 3 hours. I started in the master bedroom, working in a systematic grid from the door to the window, the way I had processed crime scenes for 4 decades. The first discovery came within 11 minutes. The smoke detector above my bed was not a smoke detector. I stood on the mattress and unscrewed the housing with a butter knife. Behind the battery compartment sat a miniature wide-angle camera lens, no larger than a shirt button, connected to a wireless transmitter the size of a postage stamp. It was positioned to capture a 160-degree view of the entire bedroom. She had been watching me sleep, watching me take my pills, watching me shake and stare at the ceiling with the vacant eyes of a man drowning in his own chemistry, recording every frame as documentation of a disease that did not exist. How do you fight a war when the walls of your own bedroom are working for the enemy? I did not remove the camera. Removing it would confirm my awareness, and awareness was my only advantage. I memorized its angle, calculated its blind spots, and moved to the bedside lamp. Inside the base, nestled against the wiring like a parasite, was a high-sensitivity microphone with its own transmitter, audio and video. A complete surveillance suite monitored from any smartphone. I reassembled both units without a trace, then reconstructed my movements over the past 3 days. The pill extraction into the pillow. My head turned away from the detector. Possibly safe. The whispered conversation with Harper. Ceiling fan on high generating ambient noise. Probably safe. The microscope analysis conducted in the locked study. I checked the study next. Clean. No cameras, no microphones. The locked door had deterred installation. The evidence beneath the floorboard was secure. That night, I waited until the house was dark before making my way to the detached garage at the back of the property. Mitchell had retreated there after dinner, claiming he needed to review blueprints. But as I crouched in the shadow of the fig tree beside the garage window, I heard something that turned suspicion into confirmation. Mitchell was crying. Not quiet grief, but the ragged, suffocating sobs of someone whose chest was being compressed by a guilt too large to contain. Between hitches of breath, his voice came through the wall, thin and breaking, speaking into a phone. I cannot do this anymore. He is my father. She said it would be painless. She said he would just fade. But I can see him disappearing every day, and I know what is in those pills, and I cannot sit across from him at breakfast and watch him die. A pause. The person on the other end spoke. Inaudible. Mitchell responded with a sound halfway between a laugh and a moan. I know what happens if I talk. She has the video. She has everything. But he is my father, and he used to carry me on his shoulders, and now he cannot carry his own coffee cup, and it is because of what we are doing to him. My son, 45 years old, sitting in a dark garage confessing his participation in my murder to someone whose voice I could not identify. He knew about the pills. He knew they were killing me, and he was too paralyzed by whatever leverage Celeste held to stop it. I pressed my back against the cold stone foundation and stared at the stars. The sky over Nashville was clear, the Milky Way visible in the rural darkness. I thought about the distance between the man Mitchell used to be and the hollow instrument he had become. He had helped me build Harper's swing set 3 summers ago, his hands sure and strong on the bolts. Now those same hands were signing the paperwork on my chemical execution. I rose and moved back toward the house, climbed the porch steps, entered through the kitchen door, and started up the staircase. I made it to the second-floor landing before I saw her. Celeste was standing at the far end of the hallway, perfectly still, outlined by faint gray moonlight from the window behind her. She was not wearing her robe. She was fully dressed, dark clothing, hair pulled back, as though she had never gone to bed. She was facing me, not moving, not speaking, just standing in the darkness with the patience of something that does not need to chase, because it has already built the cage. I stopped. The hallway stretched between us like the corridor of a morgue. "Celeste," I said, forcing the confused rasp of a man wandered from his bed. "I was just getting water." She said nothing for 3 seconds. 4. 5. Then she tilted her head, the same slight angle I had seen in Harper, and smiled. "Go back to bed, Ray. You need your rest." She turned and disappeared into the third-floor stairwell without a sound. I stood on the landing, pulse hammering, and realized the woman at the end of the hallway had not been sleepwalking. She had been positioned, waiting, watching the stairs to see who would come through the kitchen door after midnight. She knew I had been outside. The only question was how much she knew about why. A dead man was the only person left in the world I could trust, and finding him required walking out the front door of my own cage. I had spent the night after the hallway encounter performing my most convincing deterioration yet. Stumbling through breakfast with a slack jaw and a wandering gaze that I calibrated to suggest the fog was thickening. Celeste observed me with the patient attention of a scientist monitoring the final stages of an experiment. I knocked over my orange juice, apologized with a mumbled confusion, and saw the faintest trace of satisfaction tighten the corners of her mouth. She believed the dosage was working. She did not know the dosage was dissolving into my floorboards every morning and evening. By 9 o'clock, I had shuffled to the front porch and announced my intention to take a morning walk. Celeste encouraged it, the way she encouraged everything that made me appear to be a functioning patient rather than a prisoner. "Fresh air is good for circulation, Ray. Do not go too far." I nodded with bovine compliance and made it halfway down the driveway before doubling back through the tree line to the old equipment shed where I kept the spare keys to my truck. 3 hours on Interstate 40, heading west toward Memphis. The Tennessee countryside unrolled past my windows like a surgical drape being pulled back to reveal the body beneath. Golden fields and black fences, and the October sky hanging low and bruised above the Cumberland Plateau. My hands were steady on the wheel. Not trembling, not shaking. Steady. For the first time in 6 months, I was driving without the pharmaceutical fog pressing against the inside of my skull, and the road felt like liberation. I found the clinic on a side street in Midtown Memphis, a narrow storefront wedged between a laundromat and a Vietnamese grocery. The sign read, "St. Jude Free Clinic, Community Wellness Services," and the paint was peeling from the door in long, weary strips. I stepped inside and was met by the smell of institutional disinfectant and the hum of an overtaxed air conditioning unit. The waiting room was half full. Elderly patients, young mothers, a man in paint-splattered coveralls, holding a bloodied shop towel around his hand. I approached the reception desk, where a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain looked up from a crossword puzzle. "I am looking for Dr. Paul Merchant," I said. She studied me for a moment, then picked up a phone and dialed a 3-digit extension. After a murmured exchange, she pointed down the hallway. "Last door on the left." The hallway was narrow, lit by the kind of fluorescent tubes that make living skin look like it belongs in a morgue. I walked past examination rooms that smelled of rubbing alcohol and latex, past a supply closet with its door ajar, past a corkboard covered in public health flyers in 3 languages. The last door was closed. I stood in front of it for a long time, because on the other side of that door was a man I had buried, a man whose funeral had cost me $4,000 and 3 days of the worst grief I had ever experienced. And I was about to discover that the grief had been purchased with counterfeit currency. I knocked. The door opened. Samuel Prescott looked like a man who had been living inside his own ghost for a decade. He was thinner than I remembered. The broad shoulders I had stood beside in 1,000 autopsy suites now narrowed to the angular frame of someone who had spent years surviving rather than living. His hair was white, cropped close, and his face was mapped with lines that had not been there the last time I saw him in the flesh rather than the casket. but his eyes were the same. Dark, sharp, and calibrated to the specific frequency of forensic observation that only comes from decades of reading the stories written inside the dead. He stared at me for 3 full seconds. Then his jaw tightened, and something cracked behind the careful architecture of his composure. "You look terrible, Ray. You look dead, Samuel." He pulled me into the room and closed the door. The office was small, cluttered with medical journals and patient files, a desk lamp casting a warm circle of light that made the space feel like a confessional. He gripped my shoulders with both hands and studied my face the way we used to study tissue samples, searching for the pathology beneath the surface. "How long has she been dosing you?" 6 months. "Maybe longer." "I did not notice until you called." Samuel released my shoulders and sat heavily on the edge of the desk. He reached for a coffee mug, took a long drink, and then began talking with the focused urgency of a man who had been rehearsing this conversation for a decade. 10 years ago, he said, I performed the post-mortem on a woman named Eleanor Marsh, 71 years old, wealthy widow. Officially, she died of a cardiac event in her home under the care of a private nurse and a prescribing physician. Her family did not request a full autopsy. But the insurance company flagged the claim because of the policy size, $1.3 million. And it landed on my table. He paused, his eyes meeting mine with a gravity that pressed the air from the room. Her blood work came back wrong, Ray. The cardiac markers were consistent with heart failure, but underneath that I found benzodiazepine concentrations that were 3 times the therapeutic threshold. Someone had been feeding her sedatives at a level designed to weaken the cardiac muscle over months until it simply stopped. It was elegant. It was patient. And it was murder, disguised as medicine. I asked who her prescribing physician was. Samuel's voice dropped to a frequency I had only heard him use once before, during the testimony that put a man on death row in 2004, Dr. Leland Cross. The same neurologist who diagnosed your Parkinson's. The name landed in my stomach like a stone dropped into still water. Cross. The man whose calm baritone had explained my deterioration with the reassuring authority of a medical professional. The man Celeste had personally recommended, Samuel continued. He had taken his findings to the hospital administration and requested a formal investigation. Within a week, his morning coffee began tasting metallic. Within 2 weeks, he was experiencing tremors and memory lapses. He recognized the pattern because he had just documented it in Eleanor Marsh's blood. How do you outrun a poison when the people administering it are the ones writing your prescriptions? I diagnosed myself before they could finish the job, Samuel said. I had a colleague at Vanderbilt run an off-the-record toxicology panel. The results confirmed exactly what I expected. I was being dosed with the same benzodiazepine cocktail that killed Eleanor Marsh. So I made a decision. He reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a folded map, the creases worn soft from years of handling. He spread it across the desk, and I saw Tennessee and the surrounding states laid out beneath a constellation of red dots, 7 of them, scattered across the geography like drops of blood on a white sheet. I faked my death, Ray. I let them think they had won. And then I spent 10 years following the bodies. He tapped the first dot. A location in Memphis. Eleanor Marsh. Then, his finger moved east. Gerald Overton. Knoxville. Margaret Holloway. Chattanooga. The names matched the ledger in Celeste's lockbox. Each dot a grave marker for a life that had been cashed out by a network I was only now beginning to understand. 7 dots, Ray. 7 graves. And you are about to be the 8th. 7 red dots on a map of Tennessee. In my career, I had seen autopsy tables covered in less damning evidence. Samuel's finger traced the geography of death with the precision of a man who had memorized every mile between the graves. Eleanor Marsh, Memphis, February. Gerald Overton, Knoxville, September. Margaret Holloway, Chattanooga, the following April. The dots spread east and south like a slow infection, each one representing a wealthy senior citizen who had died under medical supervision with a diagnosis that explained everything and revealed nothing. "She does not work alone," Samuel said, settling into the chair behind his desk with the heaviness of a man who had carried this knowledge for a decade. "She never has. What you are dealing with is not a single predator. It is a coordinated network. 4 people, each with a specific function, operating like a surgical team." He held up one finger. "Celeste is the closer. She infiltrates the family through marriage or caregiving, establishes trust, gains access to the medication regimen, and administers the compound. She is patient, meticulous, and she never rushes. The average timeline from first dose to death is 8 to 11 months. Second finger. Dr. Leland Cross is the medical authority. He provides the diagnosis that justifies the medication. Parkinson's, early onset dementia, generalized anxiety disorder. Whatever fits the target's age and profile. He writes the prescriptions that give Celeste poison a legitimate pharmaceutical wrapper. And when the target dies, Cross is the attending physician who signs the death certificate. Natural causes. Case closed. How do you dismantle a machine that has been building coffins for 12 years when the blueprints are hidden inside prescription pads and funeral programs? Third finger. There is a compounding pharmacist in Knoxville. Samuel tapped a spot on the map between the red dots. She operates a boutique pharmacy that specializes in custom medications for elderly patients. She manufactures the specific compounds Celeste administers, formulated to mimic the side effects of legitimate neurological conditions while systematically degrading organ function. The pills you have been swallowing are her work. Handmade. Calibrated. Untraceable by standard toxicology unless you know exactly what to look for. Fourth finger. A trust and estate attorney in Chattanooga. He handles the legal architecture. Wills are amended, powers of attorney are established, and insurance policies are adjusted in the months before the target expires. By the time the funeral is over, the financial extraction is already complete. Clean, legal, and invisible. I stared at the map, feeling the weight of 12 years of orchestrated death pressing down on the small, cluttered office like atmospheric pressure before a storm. 4 people. 4 specialties. A network that functioned with the efficiency of a hospital department, except its purpose was not healing. "Samuel," I said, my voice sounding foreign in my own ears. "You have had 10 years. Why has no one stopped them?" He leaned back, and for the first time I saw the exhaustion beneath his composure, the deep erosion of a man who had been fighting alone for too long. "I contacted the FDA in 2017. They referred me to the State Pharmacy Board. The board investigated the Knoxville pharmacist and found nothing, because the compounds she produces do not appear on standard screening panels. I went to the FBI field office in Nashville in 2019. They opened a preliminary file, assigned a junior agent, and closed it 6 months later, citing insufficient evidence for a federal case." His jaw tightened. "They need a caught-in-the-act moment, Ray. They need video, audio, or a living witness who can testify to direct administration. Everything I have is circumstantial. Death certificates that look legitimate. Toxicology that requires specialized equipment to interpret. Financial patterns that could be coincidence. No prosecutor will touch it without a smoking gun." He looked at me, and I recognized the expression. It was the same look he used to give me across the autopsy table when we both knew the cause of death, but lacked the physical evidence to prove it in court. He was asking me to become that evidence. "You are the only living target, Ray. You are inside the house. You have access to the pills, the surveillance, and the daily routine. If we can document Celeste administering the compound in a controlled environment, on camera, with federal witnesses present, we can bring down the entire network in a single night." The plan was surgical in its simplicity. I would return to the farmhouse and accelerate my performance of decline. I would deteriorate rapidly enough to trigger Celeste's endgame, forcing her to move me into a hospital setting where the final dose could be administered under the supervision she trusted. Samuel had maintained a quiet relationship with a senior FBI agent named Sandra Okafor, who had inherited the closed file and believed, as Samuel did, that the network was real. Okafor was willing to coordinate a sting operation at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where Cross had admitting privileges and where the FBI could plant surveillance equipment in a controlled room. All I had to do was go home, lie down in the mouth of the wolf, and let her think she was swallowing me whole. "You taught me to read the dead, Ray," Samuel said, his hand resting on my shoulder with a weight that felt like both a blessing and an assignment. "Now I need you to go back in there and let them think you are already one of us. Can you do that? Can you lie down on the table one more time?" I looked at the map. 7 red dots. 7 families that had buried someone they loved without knowing the death had been purchased by a woman with a porcelain pill dish and a pharmacist's license. I thought about Harper, asleep in a house where the air itself was weaponized. I thought about the red ink on the last page of the notebook. November 1st. 3 weeks. "I can do it," I said. Samuel nodded and folded the map with the careful reverence of a man handling a burial shroud. He walked me to the back exit of the clinic, where the late afternoon sun was turning the Memphis skyline into a silhouette of orange and black. "Do not deviate from the script, Ray. If she suspects you are aware, she will not wait for the hospital. She will finish it at the farmhouse, and no one will be there to stop her." I drove east on Interstate 40 as the sky darkened, the headlights cutting through a thickening October mist that rolled off the Cumberland Plateau like smoke from a slow fire. The 3-hour drive felt like a descent, each mile bringing me closer to the house that was no longer a home, but a carefully constructed killing floor. When I turned onto the gravel road that led to the farmhouse, the living room light was on. A single warm rectangle of gold in the mountain darkness, and in that rectangle, motionless as a portrait, stood Celeste. She was framed perfectly in the window, her phone pressed to her ear, her eyes fixed on the approaching headlights with an expression I could not read from this distance, but could feel in the marrow of my bones. She had been waiting. And whatever she had seen or heard or calculated during my absence, she was now recalibrating the equation. I parked the truck, killed the engine, and sat in the dark for a moment. The silence of the Tennessee night settling over me like the sheet they pull over a body when the examination is complete. I was going back inside. Not as a patient, not as a victim, but as the last piece of evidence that would bring the whole machine crashing down. The hardest performance of my life was not pretending to die. It was pretending to forget the name of the child I was dying to protect. I walked through the kitchen door that evening and found Celeste at the island, a mug of chamomile in her hands, and composed concern arranged on her face like flowers on a casket. Her eyes moved across me with the precision of a clinician assessing a patient who had deviated from protocol. "Ray, where have you been? I called your phone 6 times. I let my mouth hang open, then blinked as though assembling words from scattered parts. I went for a walk, but I got turned around. Ended up at the gas station on Route 12. The man there let me sit until I remembered where I lived. I watched the calculation behind her eyes, the relaxation of her shoulders, the micro-adjustment of her grip, the imperceptible nod as she filed this episode into the medical narrative she had been constructing for 6 months. "Oh, honey," she said, reaching for my arm with a touch that felt like a blood pressure cuff. "You must have been so scared. We should call Dr. Cross in the morning." That night, I lay beneath the smoke detector camera and performed the most important scene of my career. I twitched, mumbled Miriam's name, corrected myself to garbled nonsense, then fell silent. Every sound calibrated, every movement designed to tell the story Celeste needed to believe. Over the following days, I dismantled Raymond Whitfield piece by piece. Stopped shaving, letting gray stubble age me a decade. Wore the same stained cardigan for 3 days. Left the bathroom faucet running and stood in the hallway staring at the wall until Celeste steered me back to my chair. The masterpiece came on the 4th morning. Harper walked in for breakfast, and I looked at her with manufactured blankness, studying her face as though searching a database that would not load. Then I turned to Celeste. What is the girl's name again? I keep forgetting. How do you weaponize your own destruction when the audience includes the child whose trust you are temporarily betraying? Harper's face crumpled for 1 second before she caught herself. She was 9, but she understood because I had whispered the rules 2 nights earlier beneath the ceiling fan. Too low for the microphones. Grandpa is going to pretend to be very sick. You must not cry. You must play along. Because this is how we catch the bad people. She recovered with discipline that made my chest ache. It is Harper. Grandpa, she said softly, and went back to her cereal. Celeste's reaction was the data point I needed. She did not frown. For a fraction of a second, she smiled. A reflex so brief it barely disturbed her expression. But I caught it the way I used to catch discoloration on a tissue sample that meant the difference between accident and homicide. She was pleased. The timeline was accelerating. That afternoon she called Cross. I heard her through the kitchen wall. He is deteriorating faster than projected. Forgetting names. Had a wandering episode, gone for hours. I think we need to move the evaluation up. I shuffled past the doorway at that exact moment, reinforcing her narrative with a vacant, glassy-eyed stare before continuing my slow journey to nowhere. 2 days later, I told Celeste I wanted to visit the public library to look at old family photographs. A request fitting a man grasping at fading memories. She drove me there, dropped me at the entrance, and said she would return in 2 hours. I was inside 4 minutes before walking out the back exit into a gray sedan in the staff lot. The woman behind the wheel was Agent Sandra Okafor, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and her handshake was the firmest thing I had touched in 6 months. Okafor was built like a middle linebacker who had traded the field for a law degree. Her voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. She wore no jewelry except a thin gold wedding band, and her eyes processed information with the rapid efficiency I recognized from my own forensic training. I handed her the evidence bag containing the bisected pills, photographs of the surveillance equipment, and the leather notebook from the lockbox. She opened the notebook, scanned 3 entries, and her expression did not change. But her breathing did. A single deeper inhalation. Held. Then released with controlled steadiness. Dr. Whitfield, she said, turning to the page with my name in red. If this is what I think it is, we are looking at one of the largest angel of death operations in the southeastern United States. All 7 names verified, I said. My granddaughter cross-referenced every entry against public obituary records. The dates match, the causes match, and the man who signed 4 of those death certificates is the same neurologist who diagnosed me with a death. Okafor closed the notebook into an evidence sleeve. Samuel Prescott briefed me on the Vanderbilt plan. We can have a team in place within 72 hours. Cameras. Undercover personnel. Full infrastructure. But I need you to understand what I am asking. I am asking you to walk back into that house and let the woman who has been poisoning you believe she is winning. I looked through the windshield at the library facade, where in 90 minutes, Celeste would find a confused old man on the bench clutching a printout he did not remember requesting. Agent Okafor, I said. I have spent 40 years lying down next to the dead to find the truth. I can lie down next to the living for a few more days. She allowed herself the smallest nod. Then, started the engine. I slipped out and walked back through the library to the bench, where I sat with a printout of my own wedding announcement from 1978 and waited for my killer to come pick me up. I had spent 40 years identifying killers by the evidence they left on the dead. I had never expected to identify one by the jewelry he stole from them. Dr. Leland Cross arrived at the farmhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a silver Mercedes that looked like it had been detailed that morning. He stepped out of the car with the unhurried elegance of a man who had never been questioned by anyone in a position of authority. Tall, lean, silver hair combed back from a high forehead, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most of his patients' monthly prescriptions. His shoes were polished to a mirror finish, and his handshake, when he offered it to me in the living room, was dry and precisely calibrated. 3 seconds of firm contact, followed by a smooth withdrawal. Dr. Whitfield, he said, his baritone voice carrying the warm resonance of a cello. Celeste tells me you have had some difficult days. Let us take a look and see where we are. He set his medical bag on the coffee table, with the ceremonial gravity of a priest preparing communion. Celeste stood by the kitchen doorway, arms folded, watching with the composed attention of a stage manager, ensuring every prop was in position. Mitchell was in the far corner of the room, pressed against the bookshelf as though trying to dissolve into the wallpaper. His face was the color of old paper, and his eyes were locked on the floor. Cross began with the standard neurological battery. He tested my reflexes with a small rubber hammer, tapping my knees and elbows with the rhythmic confidence of a musician. He shone a penlight into each eye, tracking my pupil response. His face inches from mine. His cologne was expensive, a heavy sandalwood blend that filled my nostrils with a warmth designed to inspire trust. Follow my finger, Ray. Left. Right. Up. Down. Good. Now tell me, what day of the week is it? I let my eyes drift to the window, then back to his face with the sluggish uncertainty of a man wading through mud. I think it is Saturday, I said. It was Tuesday. Cross made a note on his clipboard without correcting me. And can you tell me the name of the current president? I paused for the length of 3 heartbeats, then gave him a name from 2 administrations ago. He nodded with the compassionate understanding of a doctor confronting decline. And I wanted to reach across the coffee table and tell him that I had read his autopsy before he had even finished dying, that I knew exactly who he was and what that clipboard was going to authorize. How do you sit still while the man signing your death warrant checks your reflexes and tells you to follow his finger? He continued through the assessment. Memory recall tests where I deliberately scrambled sequences, coordination exercises where I exaggerated the tremor in my left hand until it looked like I was trying to shake water from my fingers. A verbal fluency test where I trailed off mid-sentence and stared at the carpet with a manufactured vacancy that I had practiced in the bathroom mirror until it was seamless. Cross set down his pen and turned to Celeste. His expression was the mask of a physician delivering difficult news, but I knew the script because I had read 7 variations of it in the leather notebook. I am afraid the Parkinson's has progressed to stage 3, he said, his voice dropping to the frequency of graveside sympathy. The cognitive markers are consistent with accelerated neurodegeneration. I am recommending inpatient management at Vanderbilt beginning this Friday. We need to stabilize the tremors and adjust the medication under controlled observation. He reached into his bag for the transfer paperwork, and that was when I saw it. His left sleeve pulled back as he extended his arm across the table, revealing 3 inches of wrist and the bottom edge of a ring. It was a gold band set with a small oval emerald, the metallic surface engraved with a delicate scrollwork pattern that I had seen exactly once before. In a photograph accompanying the obituary of Margaret Holloway, the 3rd name in Celeste's notebook. The obituary had mentioned that Margaret's family was devastated by the loss of her heirloom ring, a piece that had belonged to her grandmother and had vanished from her hand before the funeral home received the body. It was on his finger. He was wearing a dead woman's ring, a trophy taken from a patient he had helped kill, displayed with the casual arrogance of a predator who believed he was untouchable. I stared at the emerald for no more than 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, I saw the entire architecture of the network reflected in that small green stone. Cross was not just a corrupt physician writing false diagnoses. He was a collector. He took souvenirs from the people he erased. I signed the transfer form with a hand that shook convincingly, and Cross gathered his papers with the satisfaction of a man closing a successful transaction. He shook my hand again, the same 3-second calibration, and his ring pressed cold against my knuckle. Rest well, Ray, he said. Friday will be here before you know it. Celeste walked him to the door. I heard their voices in the foyer, low and efficient, the murmured logistics of 2 professionals coordinating a procedure. Mitchell remained in the corner, his eyes still on the floor. He had not spoken a single word during the entire examination. He had simply stood there, a structural column bearing weight it was never designed to hold, cracking silently from the inside. The front door closed. The Mercedes engine purred to life and faded down the gravel drive. Celeste's heels clicked back through the hallway, and she appeared in the living room doorway. She was not smiling. She was not performing. For the first time since I had known her, the mask was completely gone. Her face was a clean, expressionless surface, like a freshly prepared autopsy table. Her eyes were steady, clear, and utterly devoid of the warmth she had manufactured for 14 months. "Friday, Ray," she said. Her voice was flat, smooth, and final, like a blade being drawn across a whetstone. "Friday, and all of this will be over. You have been so brave." She held my gaze for 5 full seconds. Then the warmth returned, reassembled in an instant, and she was Celeste again, the devoted daughter-in-law. She smiled, patted my shoulder, and walked to the kitchen to begin preparing dinner. I sat in my chair and looked at the spot where the ring had pressed against my knuckle. I could still feel it. Cold, round, a dead woman's emerald, worn by the man who had signed her out of existence, and in 3 days that same hand would sign mine. There is a specific kind of pain that no autopsy can locate, because it lives in the space between a father and the son who chose to let him die. The night before Friday, I waited until the house was silent and made my way to the detached garage. Not to eavesdrop this time, but to stand in the open doorway and let my son see me for what I truly was. A man who was not dying, who had never been dying, and who knew everything. Mitchell was sitting on an overturned crate beside his workbench, a bottle of bourbon on the concrete floor between his feet. The single fluorescent tube above the bench cast a cold, buzzing light that made his face look like something pulled from a river. He was 45 years old and he looked 60. His shirt was untucked, his tie was gone, and his hands were wrapped around a glass, with the white-knuckled desperation of a man holding on to the last solid thing in his world. He did not hear me enter. He was staring at the far wall, where a framed photograph hung beside a rusted pegboard. The photograph showed Mitchell at age 12, sitting in my lap in this very garage. Both of us grinning over a model airplane we had spent an entire weekend building. The glue was still drying on the wings. "Mitchell." He flinched as though I had struck him. The bourbon sloshed over the rim of the glass, and his eyes found me in the doorway with the wild, cornered look of an animal that has been expecting the trap but is still shocked when the steel bites down. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The garage smelled like motor oil and sawdust and the sour tang of whiskey, and the fluorescent light hummed a tuneless note that sounded like the flatline on a cardiac monitor. "I know everything, Mitchell," I said. I kept my voice level, stripped of accusation, because what I needed from this conversation was not an apology but a decision. The pills, the 7 names, Cross, the cameras in my bedroom, the lockbox behind the dryer. All of it. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the concrete. He did not move to clean it. He sat on the crate with the shards of bourbon-soaked glass at his feet and his hands hanging between his knees, and he began to dismantle. It started as denial, a reflexive stiffening of the jaw and a shake of the head that lasted approximately 4 seconds before the structural integrity of his pretense collapsed completely. Then the words came, not in sentences but in fragments, torn from his chest like pieces of shrapnel being extracted without anesthesia. "She found out about Diane," he said, his voice a wet, cracked thing. "2 years ago. I was stupid. I met her at a conference. And it was nothing, Dad. I swear it was nothing. But Celeste found the texts, and then she found the hotel receipts, and then she showed me the video she had taken through the window of the room, and she said if I did not cooperate, she would take Harper and I would never see my daughter again." He looked at me with eyes that were begging for something I was not sure I could give. How do you judge a man who chose his daughter over his father when the person holding the knife made him believe he could only save one? "She told me the pills would just make you confused," he continued, the words tumbling faster now, as though releasing them could somehow reduce their weight. "She said you would fade slowly, and it would look like natural decline, and you would not suffer. She said it was merciful. She said the money would secure Harper's future, and that you would have wanted that. And I believed her because I needed to believe her, because the alternative was that I was helping murder my own father. He pressed his palms against his eyes, and his shoulders began to shake with sobs that he was trying to contain behind his hands. I watched him and felt the compound fracture of a grief that had two clean edges, one for the son I had raised and one for the stranger sitting on the crate. "Did you know about the others?" I asked. His hands dropped. His face was slick, his eyes red and swollen. "Not at first. She told me you were the only one. But 6 months ago, I found a folder in her laptop. Patient files, financial projections, 7 names with dates and dollar amounts. I realized then that she had been doing this for years, and I was already in too deep to climb out. The garage was silent, except for the fluorescent hum and the distant chirp of crickets in the October darkness. I looked at the photograph on the wall, the boy in my lap, the model airplane with the wet glue. I tried to find that boy somewhere in the wreckage of the man before me, but the search came up empty. "Did you ever love me, Dad?" Mitchell whispered. "Even after everything?" The question hung in the air like formaldehyde. I let it hang for a long time, because the answer deserved the weight of genuine consideration rather than the reflex of paternal obligation. "I loved the boy who used to fall asleep in my office while I worked late," I said. "I loved the boy who built model airplanes in this garage and could not wait for the glue to dry. I do not know the man sitting in front of me, but I know that man has a daughter who deserves a father who can look her in the eye." Mitchell's face crumbled. "What do you want me to do, Dad?" "Friday," I said. "Tomorrow, they are moving me to Vanderbilt. Celeste is going to try to finish what she started. And when she does, there will be people in that room who are going to make sure she never does it again. You have one chance, Mitchell. One chance to be the father Harper deserves instead of the coward Celeste manufactured. What you do with that chance is the only thing left of you that I am willing to wait for." I turned toward the door. Behind me, I heard the crunch of glass as Mitchell stood up from the crate. His voice came after me, cracked but carrying a note I had not heard in it for years. Something that sounded almost like the structural integrity of a decision being made. "Dad, there is something else." I stopped but did not turn around. "The USB." His voice was shaking but his words were clear. "I have been recording her phone calls for 18 months. Every conversation between Celeste and Cross, every name, every plan, every dollar amount. It is in my toolbox, in the false bottom under the socket set. I started recording the week I found the laptop folder because I knew that someday either the law or my conscience was going to catch up, and I wanted to have something left to give. I stood in the doorway with my back to my son and felt something shift in the architecture of my grief. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness was a structure that would take years to build, if it could be built at all. But acknowledgement, a recognition that somewhere beneath the rubble of cowardice and complicity, a small piece of Mitchell Whitfield had been quietly building a case against the woman who owned him. I did not turn around. I walked out into the October night, and the door closed behind me with a sound that felt less like an ending and more like the first page of a chapter neither of us had written yet. The night before Friday, I could not sleep. Not because of fear. Fear had left my body, somewhere between Memphis and the garage confession. What kept me awake was arithmetic. I had pills in a glass vial behind Gray's Anatomy. I had Mitchell's USB in a toolbox 12 feet from a man who might lose his nerve by morning. I had Agent Okafor's team assembling in a Nashville field office, synchronized to a 72-hour window that would close at noon tomorrow. I had Samuel Prescott alive in a Memphis clinic, waiting for a phone call I might never make. And I had my own body, 73 years of tissue and calcium and memory, scheduled for destruction inside a hospital I had once trusted with my wife Miriam's final breath. What I did not have was Celeste's voice on tape. Everything pointed to her. The pills, the ledger, the cameras, the 7 red dots on Samuel's map. But Celeste herself remained a shadow behind other people's evidence. Cross prescribed. Mitchell delivered. The pharmacist compounded. The attorney filed. Celeste orchestrated, but she never left fingerprints. Okafor had been clear at the library. We need her voice. Dr. Whitfield. Admissible. Recorded. Unambiguous. Without it, she walks. I had spent 40 years cutting into the dead to find truth. I knew how evidence worked. It needed to be primary, direct, unfiltered, and I had no way to obtain it. The bedroom was wired with her cameras, not mine. The study was clean, but windowless. Every phone in the house ran through a shared digital line that Celeste monitored from her own device. I was a forensic pathologist, trapped inside a surveillance grid designed by the woman I was trying to convict. At 4:17 in the morning, Harper solved it for me. I heard a soft knock on my study door. 3 taps, then 2, then 1. It was the pattern Harper and I had invented during summer hide-and-seek games, a code that meant I found you. I opened the door and she stood in the hallway wearing flannel pajamas printed with small blue whales. Her feet were bare. Her dark hair fell across her forehead in the way Miriam's used to when she woke from a restless night. In her right hand she held a device I recognized instantly. It was an old digital voice recorder, the kind journalists used in the early 2000s. Silver casing, a small red button, a tiny built-in microphone. It had belonged to Miriam. She had used it to record patient histories during her nursing shifts at Vanderbilt before the hospital switched to electronic charting. "Grandpa," Harper whispered. I recorded something. I knelt in front of her. My left hand trembled. The real tremor, not the performance. When? Tonight. After dinner. Mom was on the phone in the laundry room. She always goes there, when she thinks nobody can hear. Harper pressed the silver button. The recorder crackled, then Celeste's voice filled the dark study like smoke through a keyhole. "Cross, listen to me. Friday is final. The dose is prepared. 14 milligrams. Same compound. Same delivery. He takes it with the evening sedative at Vanderbilt, and by Saturday morning his heart stops. Cardiac arrest secondary to progressive neurological decline. You sign the certificate. Mitchell handles the estate within 90 days. The trust transfers clean. No audit. No flags. A pause. Then Cross's voice, thinner through the phone speaker, but unmistakable. And the girl? Celeste's answer was immediate. Harper stays with Mitchell. She inherits nothing until she turns 25. By then the trust is dissolved and redistributed. She is irrelevant. The recording ended. 41 seconds. 41 seconds that contained a murder plan, a named victim, a named drug protocol, a named co-conspirator, a financial motive, a timeline, and the casual dismissal of a 9-year-old child's entire existence. I looked at Harper. She was watching me with Miriam's eyes. Steady and dark and far too old for her age. She said, "I'm irrelevant, Grandpa." I pulled her against my chest. She smelled like soap and cereal and something unnameable that reminded me of every reason I had chosen to keep breathing past 2 in the morning 6 days ago. "You are the most relevant person in this house," I said. "You just saved my life." Harper leaned back. "Is Mom going to hurt you?" I held her face between my hands. The tremor in my left palm pressed against her warm cheek. Not anymore. I rewound the recording and played it again. The audio was clean. Celeste's diction was precise, unhurried, clinical. Cross's response was brief, but identifiable. The laundry room acoustics had actually helped. Hard tile and metal surfaces created a natural amplification chamber that Miriam's old recorder captured with surprising fidelity. The timestamp on the device read 9:47 p.m., consistent with the window after dinner when Celeste routinely disappeared for 15 to 20 minutes. I copied the recording onto a second device, a small SD card I kept in my desk for archiving case files. Original in the recorder, duplicate on the card. I hid the recorder inside the hollowed Gray's Anatomy beside the glass vial. The SD card went into the lining of my leather wallet. 2 locations. 2 copies. Redundancy. The first principle of evidence preservation. Harper sat on the study floor, with her knees drawn to her chest. She did not cry. She did not ask more questions. She simply waited. The way children wait when they understand that the adults around them have failed, and that silence is the only safe language left. I walked her back to her room. At the door she turned and whispered, "Grandpa, when this is over, can we live somewhere with the ocean?" I nodded. Somewhere with the ocean. She closed the door. I stood in the hallway and listened to the house breathe. Celeste was asleep in the master bedroom at the far end of the corridor. Mitchell was in the guest room downstairs, probably awake, probably staring at the ceiling, probably calculating the distance between confession and prison. And somewhere in a Nashville field office, Sandra Okafor was reviewing evidence packages and assigning positions for tomorrow. Friday was 12 hours away. I had pills. I had photographs. I had a ledger. I had Mitchell's USB. And now I had Celeste's voice, recorded by a 9-year-old girl using a dead woman's machine. The prosecution would call it evidence. I called it something else. I called it inheritance. The only inheritance worth leaving behind. Friday arrived the way death arrives in hospitals. Quietly. On schedule. With paperwork. Mitchell drove. Celeste sat in the passenger seat with a leather handbag on her lap. Her posture straight. Her hands folded. Her expression arranged into the geometry of a concerned daughter-in-law, accompanying her ailing father to a specialist appointment. She wore a cream blouse and pearl earrings. She looked like compassion. She looked like the cover photograph on a brochure for elder care. She looked like every lie I had ever autopsied, dressed in silk and sentiment. I sat behind Mitchell. Harper sat behind Celeste. The child had not spoken since breakfast. She had eaten half a piece of toast, drunk a glass of orange juice, and watched her mother with the specific stillness of a girl who had memorized a 41-second recording the night before and understood every word of it. I reached across the seat and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. 2 pulses. Our code. It meant, I am here. The drive from the farmhouse to Vanderbilt University Medical Center took 37 minutes. I counted every one of them. At minute 9, Celeste adjusted her mirror and looked at me. At minute 14, Mitchell's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. At minute 22, we passed the Nashville Public Library, where I had handed Agent Okafor an envelope 6 days ago. At minute 31, Harper whispered something I could not hear but chose to believe was a prayer. At minute 37, Mitchell turned into the hospital parking structure, and the engine died with a sound like a held breath finally released. Vanderbilt looked the same. The same glass atrium. The same polished floors, reflecting fluorescent light. The same smell of antiseptic and cafeteria coffee, layered over something older and sadder, that only people who have spent decades inside hospitals can identify. It was the smell of waiting. Miriam had worked here for 23 years. She had charted patient histories on the 4th floor, using a silver voice recorder that now sat inside a hollowed anatomy textbook in my study, holding 41 seconds of her daughter-in-law planning murder. Dr. Leland Cross met us at the neurology intake desk on the 3rd floor. He wore a white coat over a navy suit. The gold ring with the emerald setting caught the overhead light, and I let my gaze linger on it for exactly 2 seconds. Margaret Holloway's ring, the 3rd red dot on Samuel's map. Cross extended his hand. I shook it with a tremor I did not need to exaggerate. The real tremor had worsened over the past week. Stress, sleeplessness, and 6 days without the medication my body had been chemically dependent on for months. The irony was precise. Celeste's poison had created an authentic symptom that now served as my disguise. "Raymond," Cross said, his baritone filling the corridor. "How are we feeling today?" "Foggy," I said. "Tired." The left hand won't stop shaking. Cross nodded and wrote something on a clipboard. Celeste stood 3 feet behind him, her handbag against her hip, watching the exchange with the attentive patience of a woman who had rehearsed this scene before, 7 times before. A nurse led me to a private room on the 4th floor. Room 417. Single bed, cardiac monitor, IV stand, window facing west. The afternoon sun cast a long gold rectangle across the linoleum floor. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the monitor. Its screen was dark, waiting for a heartbeat to measure. By tomorrow morning, if Celeste's plan held, the screen would show a flat line and Cross would sign a certificate, attributing my death to cardiac arrest, secondary to progressive neurological decline. But Celeste's plan would not hold. Because 3 floors below me, in a utility corridor adjacent to the hospital's central security office, Agent Sandra Okafor was already in position. She had arrived at 6 that morning with a 4-person technical team from the Nashville field office. They had installed 3 concealed cameras in room 417 during a scheduled maintenance window between 7 and 8 a.m. 1 in the smoke detector, 1 in the thermostat housing above the door, 1 in the nurse call panel beside the bed. Each camera fed a live encrypted signal to a monitoring station in the utility corridor where Okafor and 2 federal agents watched on split-screen displays. Mitchell's USB had been delivered to the FBI the previous evening by courier. 18 months of recorded phone calls between Celeste and Cross. Time-stamped, unedited, devastating. Okafor's team had verified the audio signatures overnight. Combined with the bisected pills, the leather notebook, and Harper's 41-second recording, the federal case file now contained physical, chemical, documentary, and audio evidence, linking Celeste Whitfield and Dr. Leland Cross to a 12-year pattern of serial homicide. The only thing missing was the act itself. Okafor needed Celeste or Cross to administer the final dose on camera. Attempted murder, recorded in real time, inside a federal surveillance operation. That was the lock. That was the piece that would seal every door behind them and leave no exit. I lay back on the hospital bed. The pillow was thin. The sheets smelled like bleach. The cardiac monitor hummed softly in standby mode. I closed my eyes and listened to the building breathe. Its ventilation systems and distant elevators and muffled footsteps in corridors where nurses carried trays and families whispered and machines measured the distance between alive and not alive. Celeste entered at 4:15. She carried a small paper cup with 2 white pills and a plastic cup of water. She set them on the bedside table and sat in the vinyl chair beside me. Her perfume was lavender, the same lavender that had filled my bedroom the night Samuel called. The symmetry was not accidental. Nothing Celeste did was accidental. The nurse said you should take these before dinner, she said. Dr. Cross adjusted the dosage for the hospital stay. I looked at the paper cup. 2 white pills. 14 milligrams. The same compound. The same delivery. The words from Harper's recording played in my mind like a metronome. Thank you, I said. I picked up the cup. My hand trembled. This time, the tremor was real, but not from disease. From the weight of knowing that the woman sitting beside me was about to watch me die and call it mercy. I raised the cup toward my lips, and somewhere below me, behind a steel door in a utility corridor, 3 cameras recorded every frame, and Sandra Okafor whispered into her radio. Stand by. She's in the room. I did not swallow the pills. I placed them on my tongue, took a mouthful of water, tilted my head back, and let the water slide down my throat while the pills stayed lodged against the roof of my mouth. It was the same technique I had perfected at the farmhouse. Tongue pressed upward. Jaw relaxed. Swallow visible from the outside, but hollow on the inside. A magician's trick, performed by a man whose entire career had been built on the absence of illusion. Celeste watched. She always watched. Her eyes tracked the movement of my throat, the way a hawk tracks the last visible inch of a rabbit before it disappears into brush. She needed confirmation. She needed the swallow. I gave her the swallow. She exhaled softly through her nose. Satisfaction. The faintest muscular release around her mouth. It lasted less than a second. But I had spent 4 decades reading the faces of the dead and the guilty, and that micro-expression told me everything. She believed the compound was now inside my bloodstream. She believed the countdown had begun. Good, she said. She picked up the paper cup, crumpled it, and dropped it into the wastebasket beside the bed, destroying the container, eliminating the vessel, the same instinct that had kept her invisible for 12 years. Try to sleep, Ray. Dr. Cross will check on you after dinner. She stood, smoothed her cream blouse, and walked to the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. The afternoon light from the window crossed her face at an angle that divided it precisely in half. One side illuminated, warm, almost gentle, the other in shadow. I had never seen a more accurate portrait of who she was. Miriam would have wanted you comfortable, she said. Then she left. I waited. 60 seconds. 120 seconds. At 180 seconds, I turned my head toward the wall and spat the 2 pills into my palm. They were wet, partially dissolved, and the bitter metallic taste had already begun to seep into my gums. I wrapped them in a tissue from the bedside table and tucked the tissue into my pillowcase. Evidence. Even dissolved evidence was evidence. I rinsed my mouth with the remaining water and swallowed hard to push the chemical taste past my throat. The room was quiet. The cardiac monitor beeped in a steady rhythm that I knew was being recorded on 3 separate cameras positioned in the smoke detector, the thermostat housing, and the nurse call panel. Somewhere in the utility corridor below me, Okafor had just watched Celeste Whitfield hand 2 pills to a 73-year-old man in a hospital bed and instruct him to swallow. The paper cup was in the wastebasket. The pills were in my pillowcase. The video was on an encrypted federal server. The case was building, but it was not yet complete. Okafor needed more. She needed the needle. The needle came at 2:14 in the morning. I was not asleep. I had positioned myself on my right side, facing the window, with my left arm extended along the mattress and the IV port visible. The IV had been inserted at 6 p.m. during a routine intake procedure. Saline drip. Standard hydration for an admitted patient. The port sat in the crook of my left elbow, held in place by medical tape, connected to a clear line that ran to a bag hanging on the metal stand beside the bed. The bag was half empty. The drip was slow. Everything about it was ordinary. The door opened without a sound. No knock. No announcement. Just the soft displacement of air that happens when a door built on hydraulic hinges is pressed inward by someone who does not want to be heard. I kept my eyes closed. I kept my breathing steady. 8 counts in. 8 counts out. The rhythm of deep sleep. Footsteps, not Celeste's. These were heavier, measured, deliberate. Leather soles on linoleum. A man's gait. The footsteps stopped beside the IV stand. I heard the faint click of a briefcase clasp. Then the sound of latex gloves being pulled over fingers. One hand, and then the other. The rubber snapping softly against wrist skin. I opened my eyes to a slit, just enough to see through my lashes without moving my head. Dr. Leland Cross stood beside my bed in a dark overcoat. No white coat, no hospital badge. He held a syringe in his right hand. The syringe was filled with a clear liquid, approximately 10 milliliters. His left hand reached for the IV port on my arm. This was it. Not pills dissolved in water. Not a slow compound administered over months. This was direct injection. 14 milligrams of a concentrated benzodiazepine cocktail pushed straight into my bloodstream through a hospital IV line at 2 in the morning by a man wearing no identification and carrying a briefcase instead of a medical chart. If the compound reached my heart, I would experience respiratory depression within 4 minutes, cardiac arrhythmia within 9, and full cardiac arrest within 15. By 2:30, I would be dead. By 6 a.m., Cross would sign the death certificate. By noon, Celeste would begin the estate paperwork. Cross connected the syringe to the IV port. His fingers were steady. No tremor. No hesitation. He had done this before. 7 times before. His thumb moved to the plunger. I did not flinch. I did not move. I kept my breathing at 8 counts in and 8 counts out, and I let the camera in the smoke detector record every frame. The camera in the thermostat captured his face in profile. The camera in the nurse call panel captured the syringe, the IV port, and his gloved hands. 3 angles, 3 recordings, 1 attempted murder in real time. Cross pressed the plunger 1 millimeter. A single bead of liquid entered the IV line. Then the door opened. Sandra Okafor stepped into the room with a federal badge in her left hand and a weapon in her right. Behind her, 2 agents in tactical vests filled the doorframe. The hallway light flooded the room in a white blaze that turned Cross into a silhouette frozen mid-injection. Syringe still connected. Thumb still on the plunger. Margaret Holloway's emerald ring glinting under fluorescent light. "Dr. Leland Cross," Okafor said. Her voice was level, unhurried, absolute. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Remove the syringe. Step back from the patient. You are under arrest for the attempted murder of Raymond Whitfield and the suspected murders of Eleanor Marsh, Gerald Overton, Margaret Holloway, and 4 additional victims under active federal investigation." Cross did not remove the syringe. For 3 seconds he stood motionless, his thumb on the plunger, his eyes fixed on the clear line running into my arm. I watched his face. I had seen that expression before. On autopsy tables, on crime scene photographs, on the faces of men who realized, in a single irreversible instant, that the door behind them had closed forever. Then his hand released. The syringe hung from the IV port like a glass finger pointing at no one. Cross raised both hands. The latex gloves caught the light. Okafor's agents moved forward, and the handcuffs closed with a sound I had heard 1,000 times in 40 years, but never once from a hospital bed at 2 in the morning while poison dripped 1 millimeter from my heart. They removed the syringe first. An FBI evidence technician in blue nitrile gloves disconnected it from the IV port, capped the needle, and sealed it inside a clear plastic evidence bag. She labeled it with a black marker. Case number. Date. Time. 02:17 a.m. Location. Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Room. 417. Item description. 110 milliliters syringe containing clear liquid, recovered mid-injection from IV line of Raymond Whitfield. She placed the bag inside a steel case and closed the lid. The click of that lid was the sound of 12 years of murder becoming physical, tangible, prosecutable. A second technician disconnected my IV line and flushed the port with sterile saline. He worked quickly, saying nothing. I watched the clear liquid run through the tube and tried not to think about how close the compound had come to reaching my vein. 1 millimeter. The width of a pencil lead. The distance between testimony and autopsy. Okafor stood at the foot of the bed with a tablet in her hand, reviewing the 3 camera feeds. She swiped between angles. Smoke detector. Wide shot of the room. Cross entering. Briefcase on the floor. Syringe in hand. Thermostat. Close profile of Cross's face. No mask, no badge, recognizable. Nurse call panel. Direct view of the IV port. The syringe connection. The gloved thumb pressing the plunger. 3 angles. 3 timestamps. 3 pieces of footage that would play in a federal courtroom and end 2 careers. 2 lives. And 1 12-year enterprise. Built on the quiet deaths of people whose only crime was growing old with money. Cross sat in a wheelchair in the corridor, handcuffed, flanked by 2 agents. He had not spoken since the arrest. His overcoat was folded on his lap. Margaret Holloway's emerald ring was still on his left hand. Okafor had photographed it in place before the agents moved him. She told me later that Cross had looked down at the ring when the camera flashed and closed his eyes, as though the light had reached something behind them that he had kept sealed for years. "Where is Celeste?" I asked. Okafor did not look up from the tablet. "Agents are moving to her location now. She checked into the Marriott on West End Avenue at 9 p.m. Room 614. We have her phone signal confirmed and a visual from the lobby camera at 11:43. She will have a bag packed," I said. "She always has a bag packed." Okafor looked at me. "So do we." At 2:51 a.m. my phone buzzed. A text from a blocked number. 4 words. "She is in custody." I did not ask who sent it. I knew. Samuel Prescott, the dead man in Memphis, monitoring a frequency he had tracked for a decade, confirming that the woman who had turned poisoning into a profession was now sitting in the back of a federal vehicle with her pearl earrings, catching the blue strobe light. I sat up in the hospital bed. The cardiac monitor beeped steadily beside me. My heart rate was 84, elevated but controlled. The tremor in my left hand had not stopped. It would not stop. 6 months of chemical dependency had altered my nervous system in ways that no arrest could reverse. Samuel had warned me about this in Memphis. The damage was structural. The pills had rewritten parts of my brain the way fire rewrites wood. You can remove the flame, but the grain never returns to what it was. At 3:15, Okafor sat in the vinyl chair beside my bed. She placed her tablet on the mattress and showed me a series of documents her team had prepared overnight. 7 arrest warrants, 7 names. Celeste Whitfield, Dr. Leland Cross, a compounding pharmacist in Knoxville named Gareth Mosley, a trust and estate attorney in Chattanooga named Victor Dane, a private nurse in Memphis named Ruth Calloway, who had administered doses in 3 of the 7 cases, a financial advisor in Atlanta named Philip Wen, who had structured the trust transfers, and Mitchell Whitfield, listed as a co-conspirator with a cooperation agreement pending based on the USB evidence he had voluntarily surrendered. 7 names. 7 warrants. 7 people who had participated in the systematic murder of 7 elderly Americans across 4 states over 12 years. And 1/8 target, lying in a hospital bed in room 417 with a flushed IV port and a tremor that would never fully heal. "The pharmacist is the key," Okafor said. Gareth Mosley compounded every batch. Custom benzodiazepine derivatives mixed with dopaminergic antagonists designed to mimic Parkinson's symptoms while simultaneously inducing organ failure over a 6 to 12-month period. He kept batch records. We seized his lab at midnight. "The records match every victim on your partner's map." "Samuel's map," I said. "Samuel's map," she confirmed. 7 red dots. 7 victims. 7 batches. 7 death certificates signed by Cross. 7 estates transferred through Dane's office. The financials alone are enough for RICO. The medical evidence makes it serial homicide. I looked at the window. Nashville was still dark. The city lights reflected against low clouds in a pale orange haze that looked like a bruise healing from the inside. Somewhere out there, Eleanor Marsh had died in her sleep, believing her doctor was treating her tremors. Gerald Overton had collapsed in his kitchen, believing his heart had simply given out. Margaret Holloway had signed a revised trust document, believing her attorney was protecting her family. 7 people. 7 quiet deaths. 7 families who had grieved and moved on and never known that the signatures on the death certificates belonged to a man who wore his victim's jewelry like a medal. "I need to see Harper," I said. Okafor nodded. "She is downstairs with the victim services coordinator. Mitchell is in a separate room. He has signed the cooperation agreement. Full testimony in exchange for reduced charges. He will not serve more than 36 months. 36 months. 3 years. For a man who had watched his own father being poisoned and done nothing for 6 months, except cry in a garage and record phone calls. I did not know if that was justice. I knew it was arithmetic. The federal system needed Mitchell's testimony to convict Celeste and Cross. Testimony required cooperation. Cooperation required leniency. Leniency required a number. 36 months was the number. I had spent enough years inside courtrooms to understand that justice was not a feeling. It was a calculation. And Samuel? I asked. Samuel Prescott is being processed as a protected witness. His fake death complicates things legally. But his decade of independent investigation and his role in initiating contact with you will be presented as mitigating factors. He will likely face administrative charges but no prison time. I closed my eyes. The monitor beeped. My heart rate had dropped to 76. The tremor in my left hand pulsed against the thin hospital blanket like a second heartbeat that did not belong to me. A rhythm left behind by a compound designed to erase me from the inside out. The eighth body. That was what Samuel had called me in Memphis. You are about to be the eighth. But the eighth body had a pulse. The eighth body had a voice recorder and a granddaughter and a dead man's map and 40 years of reading the stories that the dead leave behind for the living to translate. The eighth body sat up in a hospital bed in Nashville, Tennessee, and waited for the sun. Mitchell came to see me at 7 in the morning. He stood in the doorway of room 417 for 11 seconds before entering. I counted. Counting had become a habit over the past week, a way of measuring the world when the world refused to hold still. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically. Mitchell was still 6'1", broad-shouldered, an architect's frame built for standing over drafting tables. But something behind his posture had collapsed. His spine curved inward at the shoulders. His hands hung at his sides with the specific limpness of a man who had surrendered something he could not retrieve. He wore the same clothes from yesterday. His eyes were swollen in the way that only prolonged weeping produces, a redness that settles into surrounding tissue like a stain. "Dad," he said. I looked at my son. 45 years old. The boy who had built model bridges out of balsa wood on the kitchen table on Belmont Boulevard. The man who had married Celeste Moreau at a vineyard in Charlottesville and smiled at me across the reception hall with a joy so complete that I had turned to Miriam and whispered, "He found it." The man who had then spent 18 months recording his wife's murder calls while delivering pills to his own father. "Sit down," I said. He sat in the vinyl chair where Celeste had sat the afternoon before. The chair made the same slow compression of air. Mitchell placed something on the mattress beside my hand. A black USB drive. Small, rectangular, 18 months of recorded calls between Celeste and Cross. Timestamps. Victim references. Dosage instructions. The entire architecture of a murder operation stored on plastic, smaller than my thumb. "I gave a copy to the FBI last night," he said. "This is the original. I want you to have it." I picked up the USB. It weighed almost nothing. 18 months of complicity and slow-motion patricide should have been heavier than 12 grams. But evidence never weighs what it should. A bullet weighs 9 grams. A death certificate weighs 1 page. The weight of the object never corresponds to the weight of the act. That is the central lie of physical evidence. It is always lighter than the truth. "When did you start recording?" I asked. 14 months after the wedding. Mitchell's voice was flat, hollowed out. I found a spreadsheet on her laptop. Names, dates, dosages, asset values. I recognized one of the names. Eleanor Marsh. Wealthy widow in Memphis. Died of cardiac arrest. I searched the other names. Gerald Overton. Margaret Holloway. All dead. All wealthy. All over 65. All with the same attending physician on the death certificate. "Cross," I said. "Cross." He closed his eyes. I confronted Celeste. She didn't deny it. She opened her phone and showed me a video. Diane and me. A hotel room in Atlanta. She said if I told anyone, the video would go to you, to Harper's school, to my firm. She said she would tell police that I had been involved from the beginning. "So you stayed." I stayed. And I started recording. Every call, every instruction. I told myself it was protection, something I could use if I ever found the courage to leave. He opened his eyes. "I never found the courage, Dad. Not until you found it for me." I held the USB between my thumb and forefinger. 12 grams. 7 victims. 1 marriage. 1 affair. 1 blackmail video. 1 father slowly dying in a monitored bedroom. You should have come to me, I said. I know. The day you found that spreadsheet. I know. His voice broke on the second word. A small fracture that exposed something underneath. The sound of a man reaching the bottom of his own justifications and finding nothing beneath them. I wanted to be angry. I had earned it. 6 months of poison. 6 months of tremors and fog. My son had known. My son had delivered the pills. But anger requires a future. It requires the belief that the feeling will lead somewhere. I was 73 with permanent neurological damage, sitting in a room where a man had tried to inject poison into my arm 6 hours ago. I did not have the luxury of anger. I had the luxury of choice. Keep my son or lose him. Hold the USB or hold the grudge. Mitchell, look at me. He looked. His eyes were empty of everything, except the fear that the next sentence would sever us permanently. You are going to testify. Every name, every date, every call. You are going to stand in front of a federal jury and say what you did and what you failed to do. You are going to serve whatever sentence they give you, and when it is over, you are going to come find me and Harper, and we are going to sit on a porch near the ocean and not talk about any of this for as long as we need. Mitchell's face collapsed. Not into tears. Into something deeper. The architectural mask he had maintained for 18 months fell away. And beneath it was the boy who had built bridges on the kitchen table and believed they could hold weight. I'm sorry, Dad. I know you are. The door opened. Harper stood in the hallway wearing flannel pajamas with small blue whales. A victim services coordinator stood behind her. Harper looked at Mitchell, then at me, then at the USB. She walked to the bed and climbed up beside me, tucking herself under my right arm the way she used to during thunderstorms. She did not say anything to Mitchell. Her silence said everything my words had tried to soften. Mitchell stood. He looked at his daughter curled against my side. He nodded once, a small motion that carried the full weight of every sentence I had spoken. Then he walked out. His footsteps faded down the corridor. Steady, measured. The gait of a man walking toward a door he had chosen to open. Harper pressed her face against my chest. Is it over, Grandpa? I held her. The tremor in my left hand vibrated against her shoulder blade. Almost, I said. Almost. 6 months later, I stood on a porch in Charlottesville, Virginia, and watched the Blue Ridge Mountains turn the color of bruised copper in the late October light. The house was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a gas stove that clicked 3 times before the flame caught. The porch wrapped around the front and one side, wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and a table between them, where I kept a mug of black coffee every morning and a glass of bourbon every evening. The bourbon was new. Dr. Amara Singh, at the University of Virginia Neurology Department, had told me that moderate alcohol posed no additional risk given my current medication regimen. I had asked her to define moderate. She had said 1 glass. I had said 1 large glass. She had not smiled, but her eyes had. Harper chose the house. She had found it on a real estate website during the 3 weeks we spent in a furnished apartment near the UVA campus while I completed my initial treatment protocol. She had scrolled through dozens of listings, rejecting each one with the decisive authority of a 9-year-old who understood exactly what she wanted. Too close to the road. No trees. Ugly mailbox. Then she had stopped scrolling and turned the screen toward me. A white clapboard cottage on 3 acres, bordered by a split-rail fence, with a view of the mountains from every window on the western side. This one, Grandpa, she had said. This one feels right. She was correct. It felt right. Not in the way the farmhouse in Nashville had felt right, which was the feeling of history and obligation and the slow accumulation of decades. This was different. This was the feeling of choosing, of walking into a space that owed you nothing and deciding to fill it with whatever you had left. Harper enrolled at a local elementary school in September. She made 2 friends within the first week. A girl named Josie, who collected rocks, and a boy named Dev, who could name every species of bird in Albemarle County. She brought them to the house on weekends, and they sat on the porch and sorted rocks by color, while Dev pointed at birds in the tree line and announced their names with the gravity of a field biologist presenting findings. Harper laughed during these visits. Not the careful, measured laughter of a child monitoring her environment for threats. Real laughter. The kind that starts in the stomach and reaches the eyes before the mouth catches up. I watched her, and I thought about Celeste. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the clinical detachment of a man who had spent 40 years examining the aftermath of human failure and understood that some questions do not resolve into answers, they resolve into distance. Celeste was awaiting trial in a federal detention facility in Knoxville. The case had been assigned to the Middle District of Tennessee, consolidated with 6 additional homicide charges across 4 states. Okafor's team had built a case file that ran to over 11,000 pages. Cross had entered a guilty plea in exchange for life imprisonment without parole. The Knoxville pharmacist, Gareth Mosley, had cooperated fully and was expected to receive a reduced sentence. Victor Dane, the Chattanooga attorney, had fled to Costa Rica in August and was the subject of an international warrant. Ruth Calloway and Philip Wen were both in custody awaiting separate trials. Mitchell was serving his 36 months at a minimum security facility in Alabama. He wrote letters, 1 per week, addressed to Harper, but written for both of us. He described the facility's library, the garden where inmates grew tomatoes, a woodworking class where he was building a birdhouse. The letters were careful, restrained, architectural in their construction, each paragraph load-bearing, each sentence measured for weight. Harper read them on the porch and sometimes asked me to explain words she did not know. She never cried while reading them. She folded each letter precisely and placed it in a shoebox under her bed. I did not know what that shoebox meant to her. I did not ask. Some containers are not meant to be opened by anyone other than the person who fills them. Samuel visited in September. He drove from Memphis in a rented sedan and arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a paper bag containing 2 bottles of Tennessee whiskey and a new leather-bound notebook. He looked healthier than he had in the clinic. His color had returned. His hands were steady. He sat in the second rocking chair, and we drank whiskey and watched the mountains darken and did not talk about the case for the first 40 minutes. When he finally spoke, he said, "You look like a man who has decided to live." I considered the statement. It was accurate. Somewhere between the hospital bed in Nashville and the porch in Charlottesville, I had made a decision that I could not locate in any specific moment, but that had restructured everything around it. The decision was not dramatic. It was not a revelation. It was more like a bone setting. A fracture that had been misaligned for months, finally clicking into place, quietly, without ceremony, and the body recognizing the correction and beginning to rebuild around it. My health had stabilized but not recovered. The tremor in my left hand was permanent. Dr. Singh had confirmed what Samuel had warned me about in Memphis. 6 months of chemical exposure had caused irreversible changes to my basal ganglia. The tremor would remain. Some mornings were worse than others. Some evenings the shaking migrated to my forearm and made holding a pen difficult. I had switched to typing my notes on a laptop Harper had helped me set up. She had chosen a dark blue case for it and placed a small whale sticker on the lid. I did not remove the sticker. I no longer practiced forensic pathology. My license remained active, but my hands could not perform the work my mind still understood. I had accepted a consulting position with the Virginia Medical Examiner's Office, reviewing case files and toxicology reports from home. The work was quiet, detailed, and familiar. It required the same pattern recognition that had defined my career. The same ability to read the language the dead leave behind. The The difference was that I now read it sitting in a rocking chair with a view of the mountains instead of standing over a steel table under fluorescent light. On Saturdays, Harper and I drove to a farmer's market in downtown Charlottesville. She picked out apples and bread and a jar of local honey that she insisted tasted different from store honey. I carried the bag with my right hand while my left trembled at my side. We walked slowly. We did not rush. There was nowhere to be except where we were. One Saturday in late October, Harper stopped at a stall selling handmade greeting cards. She picked one up, studied it, and put it back. Then she picked up another. It had a drawing of an ocean on the front. Simple blue waves under a pale sky. She bought it with coins from her jacket pocket and handed it to me. "For when Dad comes home," she said. I held the card. Blue waves. Pale sky. A 9-year-old girl's faith that the people she loved would eventually find their way back to the same porch, the same view, the same silence that did not need to be filled because it was already full. I put the card in my shirt pocket. Next to my heart. Next to the tremor. Next to everything that was broken. And everything that remained. We walked home through the October light. And the mountains turned copper. And the silence between us felt exactly the way silence should feel when it has nothing left to hide.